The general context of what I do is, by and large, three major areas. I work with augmentative communication, so if someone is having significant difficulty with their speech, sorry, I always have to make sure I'm not attached to a wire one way or another. If someone's not able to speak, we work with a variety of devices that may allow techniques that allow people to communicate. Obviously, employment communication is more or less a prerequisite, so that might be something that we would do some significant work with someone on a return to work basis. I will be focusing a little bit more on computer access, and that being kind of the thing that most people are going to be using for work, but we'll touch on some of that. We also work with what's called environmental control, so if you're having difficulty with using something like a telephone, or a lamp, or a fan, or even things like a television and so on, there are various options that allow somebody that has upper extremity impairments or visual impairments, for example, to do those things. I'll be focusing mostly in the context of the workplace, given the nature of the lecture. I gather it's fairly entertaining to watch me lose my train of thought. So if you do have a comment or a question, feel free to throw out a hand or indicate it to me, and we can try to address that. I'm going to go a little bit mile wide and inch deep in terms of the techniques and the options that I present, with some hope that we'll be able to circle back at the end of the presentation if you've got stuff that you want me to kind of show more in depth, then I can try to do so. But those are just kind of a few of the ground rules for the lecture. A little bit more about me. I am an occupational therapist. I worked in the inpatient units here for a few years before I started assistive technology in '99. So I've been doing full-time assistive tech for a long time. I kind of say it makes me a very, very slightly large fish in an exceedingly small pond. There's just not many places that give the opportunity to do that and practice that, especially to have access to the actual technology while it's here. So that'll be something that we can kind of, just it helps me also to know that there's other stuff out there, like people using this stuff in their environment, because all of my work is basically done in the clinic. So I'll appreciate some of the back and forth as we kind of go as well. So, mainly going to be talking about what we talk about a lot within the department, and that's essentially known as access. So that is, how does somebody operate a given piece of technology? How does somebody use a specific piece of technology or adaptation in the most efficient way possible? We talk a lot about efficiency. I see a lot of people who might be able to, for example, use one finger to type, right? And obviously, that's a way to do it. But I also spend a lot of time talking about the efficiency. If I'm thinking about competitive employment, I will tell my patients that, in general, one finger at a time, you need to figure out some ways of getting faster than that, right? So we talk a lot about the efficiency angle to that. I talk a lot about the subcognitive portion of access. If you are a touch typist, meaning you type with all 10 fingers without looking at the keys, if you're a good touch typist, we often talk about that being a subcognitive skill. I don't need to think about where the keys are. My fingers pretty much just go there at a subcognitive level. In fact, if you ask a really good touch typist, where's the P key, they have to scan the whole keyboard. They don't know where it is. But their finger will go right there. And that's what we call a subcognitive goal. So I kind of want my access as much as possible. As you'll see, some of the things I show are maybe not realistic for that. But as much as possible, I want that to be at that subcognitive level to make somebody as efficient as possible. I mentioned a little bit about assistive technology and the goals that are related to it. Obviously, if it's a return to work situation, there's a lot of options kind of across the board that we'll be dealing with there, and I'll get into those. So we talk about the goals for technology. Again, I work with a lot of patients on an inpatient and an outpatient basis, and somebody might not want to be at a subcognitive level for the most efficient way possible. If somebody just wants to type a message to their family member, what time are you home? They may not need to go through some of the more in-depth options that I have that are available, right? Because it may be fine for them to just type kind of one point at a time, and maybe that text message takes about a minute to send. But say, okay, that's fine. I want to know what are the goals. So, if you want to use this for competitive employment, we might need to up that game a little bit, right? But if somebody doesn't want that, that's going to be kind of important. I get a lot of people who think the technology is kind of cool, right? iPads, iPhones, they're kind of cool, right? And I get a lot of people coming in and they want to use it because it's kind of cool. And that's not, the human factors that go into using a piece of technology are actually really quite important. If something doesn't look well, if somebody has, you may notice that I'm not the most aesthetically oriented person in the world. I do not care. But if this piece of stuff hanging off of me doesn't look good for someone, that's going to be an important factor. And a lot of that goes into what we'll call technology tolerance. Back in the old days when we used to have VCRs, we used to say if you were someone who could remote program your VCR to record a show at a later time, who knows VCRs? If you could remote control your VCR to record a program at a later time, we used to say you had a high technology tolerance. You're probably going to see at various times today that something will go wrong with my technology, right? And if it does, how do I deal with that? It's the nature of my job, I'm kind of good at that, but if somebody doesn't have that option for technology tolerance, we have to look at that in terms of the reliability of what's there, setting up the expectations around that. Briefly, I obviously need to know what's going on with someone's vision. That's a pretty profound issue. No pun intended, it's often overlooked in the rehab field. If there's some relatively minor visual deficits, it will have a pretty profound influence on the use of the screen or technology, right? I want to know about cognition, new learning, short-term memory. Are there options that I need to use? There's a lot more options available now just on your smartphone for things like reminders and calendar appointments and stuff like that to try to compensate for some of those issues. I spend a lot of time talking about upper extremity impairment because that has the influence of how I'm operating a given piece of technology, right? I'll talk a fair amount about positioning and ergonomics, although some of that's a little bit more of a basic level. So I'll be talking about all those things kind of as we go. Briefly about ergonomics at kind of a basic level. I often want to say that I want to avoid long periods on a laptop. A laptop, kind of no matter what way you cut it, is a bit of an ergonomic nightmare. I either have my hands up to where I can see my monitor comfortably, or my hands are down and my neck is forward. So I often talk about just some of the simple things. Let's move the monitor up so that I'm not in this posture, I have to go into this posture of going up and down. Kind of a few basic things like that. We talk about changing position a lot. Can you stand up for part of your day? A standing desk becomes really important for some people, right? If there's a pain issue, but even just for general principles. Can I change my position, bring one or the other of those up or down so I'm not relying on the same groups of muscles at all times? Same thing with changes of task. Hey, look, just getting up and taking a water break so I can walk down the hallway a couple of times, maybe once every couple of hours, is potentially going to make a big difference to ergonomics. So some of those kind of more basic things like that. A little bit more in depth, again, kind of some of the basic or more or less prerequisite, I'm calling this part of it kind of the prerequisite stuff that realistically almost anybody should figure out. I'm wearing reading glasses at this point in my life. I didn't need them until a few years ago. Probably would have been beneficial for me to have been magnifying my text a lot earlier than I actually did. Because I started to notice that I was kind of straining and having to keep stuff farther away. Finally, I got to the end of my arm, and that's the time for glasses, right? So, but I probably could have benefited from some magnification a little bit earlier. A little bit about positioning. There's widely available just plain old tablet mounts. If you go to Micro Center or Best Buy, tablet mounts, wall mounting, projecting to an HD TV, all that kind of stuff is really pretty readily available, let's say at Best Buy or a Micro Center or something like that. So give at least a little bit of thought to that in terms of some of the basic stuff. A little bit about my more specialized kind of role. I'll get a little bit more into what we call feature matching. So again, I often have to tell my clients I'm not IT. I also don't work for Best Buy. That's not my job. My job as a therapist is to try to understand what are the issues, deficits, and strengths you are dealing with. And then we go through a process called feature matching, which is identifying the given pieces of software or hardware that really take advantage of the strengths and or compensate for any deficits. So that feature matching process is kind of the key to what I do as a OT, as opposed to Best Buy, who will say, here's my data. Client preference, I kind of mentioned earlier, that's a huge factor that is really very critical to the adoption of technology. If somebody doesn't like the way it looks, doesn't like the color, doesn't, something looks kind of goofy, or they just prefer not to use a given thing, that honestly is going to be the most that's going to be the most important case for adoption of technology or not. I talk a lot about trials whenever possible. I try to get somebody to do a trial. I see a lot of patients who don't have funding for the equipment that we talk about. So even a relatively small amount of money can be a big deal to someone if they're on a fixed income. So I spend a fair amount of time figuring out how to get a free trial or some other ways of getting stuff free before I ask somebody to purchase software. By the same token, we try to do purchases with return policies. Just makes life a little bit easier when possible. So a little bit more about some of the goals. I mentioned briefly earlier that I've been talking about communication. If somebody does have, what is communication? Obviously, we talk about.
Just pause. Give me 2 seconds. Okay.
Should I keep talking? Yes. Okay, sounds good. I'm going to sit there for quite a while more. So yeah, communication. Obviously, if somebody is verbally having issues, it may be a situation where someone cannot speak at all. It may be a situation where somebody may be able to say some things, but might not be able to get like a longer or more in-depth communication out. Or it may be a situation where somebody just really needs clarification on some relatively advanced topics. That even on a face-to-face level, we try to have an option available for communication. So a speech therapist and I will get together in that event to talk about which of the devices are going to be most effective if someone's got a significant speech issue. And I'll be demonstrating one of those devices a little bit later on. But there's a lot, it really is its own lecture, because obviously the language deficits and obviously communication goes way beyond the workplace. So we will spend a lot of time talking about that, but at any rate. But if you don't mind, could you give me a heads up at about 12:40, because I'm here. Thank you very much. So face-to-face communication is kind of its own thing if there's a significant speech deficit. With or without speech deficits, obviously being able to use the phone, texting has gotten much, much more integrated into our working environment, I think. Obviously doing Skype or FaceTime or video or audio calls over the internet. Social networking has become a lot more important to some people's jobs, right? I mean, there's some people, when I started in the field, we didn't have Facebook. Now there's full jobs that are social media influencers, et cetera, right? So all of that can become important to those kinds of things and might handle with assistive technology. People might have goals for it. Coming back a little bit to those communication devices and how those kind of integrate. They are essentially designed for that face-to-face communication, but they will also handle a lot of the phone, texting, et cetera, et cetera. So I can text, if I connect my phone, I can text message through my communication device. So if I'm not able to access my phone directly, maybe I'm using my communication device to do that. I can email. In general, those devices are a lot more expensive and they're not necessarily suitable for everyone, right? In general, I talked about funding a minute ago. Most of what I deal with is not funded through health insurance, but communication devices are. There's some hoops we have to go through. It's not dependent on employment. It's dependent on medical need. So we can usually get that done. There are those options for computer access and environmental control, but I will say they are really designed best for face-to-face communication. The rest of the stuff is a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. Technically speaking, you can build a house with a Swiss Army knife, right? You got a saw, you got a screwdriver, you can use it as a hammer. Should anybody actually build a house with a Swiss Army knife? Probably not, right? So it does a lot of different things, not necessarily very well, but it's an option and that'll be something that we'll use. And in fact, it's a big issue with the adoption. I do have people who don't want to depend on their devices for face-to-face communication, but they use them for texting. So be it, and that's great, and I think we should use it that way. Okay? So I won't talk a lot more about the communication stuff specifically, but we can circle back around to that if there's questions. Computer access, obviously being able to do email, word processing, reviewing documents. Generating documents versus reviewing documents are obviously distinct goals, and there are very different tools that might be used for that, right? Internet access is pretty much a prerequisite for employment at this point, right? Does somebody need to get into databases or spreadsheets? The quickest way to watch me turn white is to have a patient come in and ask me how do I get into Microsoft Access. I have no idea how to use that program to start with. I'll find the tools that will let you do it, but I'm glad you know what to do in that program. And there are options that will allow you to do that. Okay, so a little bit about some of those tools. I'm going to kind of briefly go through a few different options and start to show some as we go. Keyboards for accessing a computer or a smartphone or what have you. Obviously, the size can make a difference. There can be small keyboards, large keyboards, and so on. Just real briefly, where'd it go? This is a big keys keyboard with a key guard on it. So if somebody wants to tap away at it, we have them upstairs. But basically, obviously, as the name implies, it's a computer keyboard with 8 keys. Just for perspective, this is it against like a standard desktop keyboard that you probably all have at your desk or on your laptop versus a smaller keyboard. So sometimes the size makes a big difference. The key guard is just the plastic overlay that fits over it. I have a lot of people with a tremor who they might not be able to kind of get to the keys. If I have this off, they'd be happy to hit all the keys with their whole hand. But they can get to where they want and then hit the individual key with one finger. And the key guard can make a big difference for accuracy in that sense. So key guards are often helpful. Configuration gets overlooked a lot, but if I have a one-handed typist, sometimes there's a configuration called Widgets, which is in the software of your Windows operating system, I think on your Mac also. But it puts the more commonly used keys closer to one area of the keyboard versus the standard, what we call QWERTY layout. So maybe we might consider some different layouts. Physical versus on screen. Obviously, touch screens with keyboards on them are relatively ubiquitous at this point, and that might be an option that people can use. There are a variety of specialized one-handed keyboards, so if I have somebody that is using only one hand on the keyboard, this is common following a stroke, we might get into some one-handed keyboards. Bunch of different options kind of along those lines. Okay, quick questions on keyboards. Anything anybody uses in particular that I didn't mention? All right, these years I will learn the plural of computer mouse, but never quite figured that one out. Obviously, again, touchscreens are relatively ubiquitous. There are a variety of options for using your hand on a mouse, above and beyond kind of your standard desktop mouse or your trackpads. If I'm using it with an upper extremity, maybe I don't have good isolated finger control. There will be options like trackballs and things like that that can be helpful for a lot of people. I can use my head, I can use my eyes to control all of those options. Dwell clicking will often make a big difference to people. Dwell clicking is just where, rather than having to physically click the mouse, and I have a lot of people, I should explain, rather than physically clicking the mouse, I bring the mouse cursor to wherever it is that I want to click, and I hover for a predetermined length of time. That might be 1 second, might be half a second, might be a second and a half, whatever. Software will automatically send a click. So that's what I mean by dwell clicking, and I might use that with all of these different types of mouses. At a coworker, and it's a relatively common pain issue that someone can move the mouse around just fine, but they develop a lot of pain when they click the mouse. So dwell software is sometimes a real simple, easy way of fixing that. I'll talk a little bit, let's talk tremor for a minute. Lots of times just changing the position of the mouse, again, that's sort of an ergonomic issue, but if I'm somebody that has trouble bringing my arms up, I have a lot of people who are very successful with using a variety of mouses just in their lap on a clipboard, as opposed to coming up to a mouse station, right? Tremor, if somebody does have a tremor, which is a relatively common issue for a variety of perspectives, quite often one of the best things you can do is just a regular desktop mouse. In the therapy world, we call it a closed circuit, but if I have a tremor, and I'm trying to keep my arm in the air to reach for a target, the tremor is really influenced. If I put my hand down on the table on a desktop mouse and I keep the contact, that often does a lot to minimize or eliminate my tremor. So sometimes a standard desktop mouse is the best option because they're not having to constantly lift off and on like they would with a trackpad or a trackball. Okay? Mouse keys, if you have a dedicated number pad on your computer, so if you're on a laptop, you might have to add it, or it's just the standard number pad on the right-hand side of the keyboard, you can use those keys to operate the mouse. They'll do up, upper left, upper right, right, and so on around the 7 or 8 keys that go in those directions. And that's often a really nice option, again, for someone with a tremor. They have a hard time getting to the target. They have a hard time with the constant lift off and lift on, but they can hold that mouse down and it works very nicely. And that's included in your operating system. So free and widely available. Steady Mouse software is available as a download. Most people are familiar with trackpads. Mary Beth, would you mind grabbing a trackball from upstairs? I'll show a trackball in a minute when it comes back down. The trackball is a nice option for someone without isolated finger control. Because again, it allows me to control a relatively large roller ball with my relatively gross arm motion. Or if I, for example, had an amputation or something like that. So those are all options. Again, dwell or switch clicking are available. By switch, I just mean a variety of different types of buttons. I use this one because it's obviously really easy to see in a large environment, but they will come a lot smaller. And I can connect this to my computer to send my clicks. So if I'm somebody that say wants to click with my leg, that's an option that we might use. So maybe I'm moving my mouse around and then clicking with my leg. A bunch of options along those lines. I knew I was going to get hung up on a cable at least once today. Okay, so let's talk about head-activated mouse for a moment. This is an option called a Tracker Pro. I'm going to put it on my computer here. It is USB, it is plug and play. I'm progressively running into more and more issues with information technology professionals not wanting me to install adaptive software and stuff like that, right? So those are issues that we might have related to all of this. Excuse me while I do a couple of other settings here. Okay. So this trackball, and I apologize, I'm hoping you will be able, you might not be able to see this, you might have to trust me, but we'll see. Okay, so the there we go. So the way that the Tracker Pro works is there's a small reflective dot that's at the center of these glasses. As I tell various people, you don't have to wear these glasses, but I do offer a free photo shoot of me with them on, and I post it to my Facebook page. Any volunteers? Crickets. That dot that's at the center can be worn on your eyeglass frame. It's just a reflective dot. In the case of the Tracker Pro, I believe it is active infrared, meaning it's broadcasting an infrared light, which reflects off the dots. Now, if I start showing a video and it doesn't show up on the screen, please feel free to let me know that. Really love how PowerPoint takes over your computer sometimes. Okay, so I'm sort of hopeful, that's my mouse on the screen, I'm sort of hopeful that you will be able to see that I'm moving the mouse around on the screen. Is that visible at all? Yeah. Great. So I actually have the mouse upside down. So I move my head up and my mouse goes down. Aren't you guys impressed? So if I flip the mouse in the right direction, by the way, it is traditional for assistive technology to fail at least once miserably in front of large groups of people who you're trying to impress. It's all part of my time. But that head mouse allows me to move my mouse cursor around on the screen. And when I hover over whatever it is that I want to click on, I can click using the aforementioned Dwell software or using my click or what have you. But I have a lot of people who will use their head motion very adequately to allow them to control the mouse cursor on the screen. By extension, I should have mentioned earlier, there's lots of ways to use your keyboard to activate various mouse functions using mouse keys or using keyboard shortcuts. So if you are somebody that does really, really well with the keyboard, but the mouse is hard, one of the things I might look at is figuring out how to use your keyboard to operate the computer. Vice versa, there's nothing stopping me from using my mouse to type on an on-screen keyboard as well. So that are all the options that we might consider using. Okay? All right. There are, just to briefly talk about some of the situations I've run into, again, that aforementioned issue with software being administered and installed. If it's a larger company, we often have some difficulty dealing with that. I'm very happy to work with some very fine voc rehab professionals who can help me kind of advocate for some of that in terms of talking to IT departments and saying, hey, this is a reasonable accommodation. You need to get this software installed so this person can work, right? As we know in practice, sometimes it takes a while. So if I can have something that doesn't require that additional software, that's a factor. And the Tracker Pro is plug and play, meaning I plug it into pretty much any computer in the world, and it will start working without additional software. So that's something that I will kind of consider. I mentioned the infrared issue earlier. I've worked with clients that were in very sunny offices, and the sunlight has knocked out the infrared capabilities. So it's kind of nice to know if there's a Bluetooth connection or a radio frequency gyroscopic option. Those will allow me to, that can make a difference in that office environment, right? XY differential. If I'm somebody that has a lot of difficulty moving my head up and down, but I've got pretty good right to left, some mouse programs will allow me to change the relative speed of the horizontal motion versus the vertical motion to make it a little bit more accurate and easy for my patient to access the whole screen. So those are options that we might think about or consider using. Okay. Just a few examples of what I just talked about, and just some I should say, again, I'm not Best Buy, but I did try to include some brand names of the products in here, so if you're good with Google, you can probably find someone who will sell it, but obviously you're also welcome to contact us or talk to somebody in the assistive tech department here, and my email's in the presentation. But if you are specifically looking for a product, I tried to write the brand names in here with one exception, which I'll talk about. Okay. Okay, and yeah, these are just a few of the different examples of some of the more modern options that are out there. Okay? All right, so electronic eye gaze. So I'm not going to be able to show this very effectively. It's just kind of really tough to do it to a large group of people. But if people want to come up and either try it or watch me do it a little bit more, we'll try with my camera in a minute. There are various eye gaze systems that are available. As the name implies, they track your eye movement. Wherever it is that you look, you can then kind of control and or type. Okay? They are relatively expensive. They're getting a lot cheaper. We used to be $25,000 plus. At this point, I can get a functional eye gaze camera that will work for computer access for closer to $800 or $900. And there's even one that's about $150, which I'm using for training as well as thinking about as a supplement for people. So they are relatively expensive, but nonetheless, it's getting better. Has anybody tried the new iPhone eye tracking? I'm told it's there. I'm guessing it's not very good, but interested to see. A lot of the stuff is kind of getting integrated a lot more just into the world, right? Sometimes they're difficult to use with standard computer software. I will demonstrate that in a minute. I'm going to show you how I use it with communication device software, which is just a little bit more integrated with eye gaze. So that AAC, I should add, is augmented alternative communication, and that's what I was talking about related to the speech deficits earlier. But AAC software is kind of where I can show eye gaze a little bit more effectively. So let's give that a try. Okay. So again, I do want to make it clear, I'm trying to do this under the influence of so that you guys can see it on the camera. Remember everything I was saying about ergonomics earlier, you would not do it the way I'm doing it right now. But basically, if I'm positioned in the right spot, you can just stick it up on the table, thank you very much. If I'm positioned in the right spot, can you guys see the relatively large red dot that's swinging all the way around on whatever it is that I'm looking at?
Yeah.
Great. Doesn't help that my device is vibrating. There we go. So I'm obviously in a really awkward spot here, but I'm typing by staring at my letters, and that's an example of that Dwell software. So I am typing at the O, or I'm looking at the O. I just got the P. So I'm just going to backspace. Oops, I don't want to clear everything. So, and I do want to be clear that if I was better positioned, probably would help if I recalibrated to the environment that I'm in. It actually, interestingly enough, I'll try it again. Thank you for doing that. I will try it again. What's reflecting? So I will try it again, but probably we just made it harder for me to use it by turning off the lights. But it does make it a little bit easier for you guys to see, perhaps. Or maybe it's better. So if I finish typing, you might not be able to see, but I'm using word prediction. which is another option. And that says is an example. So I'm going to type an using my word prediction. Now I'm going to type E, X. I'm going to backspace that. And I'm going to cheat because I want to see if I can get the word prediction. So now I have word prediction available on my second button there of eye gaze technology. So basically, if somebody would like to see that a little bit better demonstrated, happy to show it afterwards. But it is a little bit tough to use in the context that I'm in right now. All the things that I just mentioned, that difference in lighting is potentially going to make a big difference. To say what's happening is it's basically I go through a calibration process where I look at a series of dots on the screen. A camera tracks the eye of my eyeball and takes a picture of it in each of the positions. After that, it can algorithmically tell where I'm looking on the screen by the nature of the pictures that it took. When we turned off the lights, my pupils got larger. So that changed the picture that it got, right? So that can be an influence on the eye gaze, positive or negative. I mentioned the positioning. The positioning is obviously a little bit awkward because I'm trying to get it on camera, et cetera, but you can see it still kind of works, right? If I have it better positioned, that will make a big difference. One of the things that I'll spend a fair amount of time doing is training people to kind of recognize all of those different issues that are going on. So we'll circle back to that in a little while if people are interested, but that's kind of, I want to move on to a couple of other things. I can use it, you saw me using it to type on a standard keyboard, or sorry, on communication device software, relatively large fonts. I can, if I'm more appropriately positioned, type adequately on the standard Windows keyboard, so I can do some typing just in the Windows environment. There are various ways to allow me to access options within the Windows environment as well. There's a couple of Mac options out there, but they're not as available. If you are a note taker, or you want to email me, I realize I neglected to put the brand names of kind of some of the more common products that we'll work with, but this is a Tobii Dynavox I series. Stuff is changing all the time. I literally don't have a picture of the newest and most up-to-date device that got released last week. If I give this presentation again next week, I'll have those pictures updated. But it does change in the world quite a bit. Prentke Romanic Accent is another vendor in the local area. So if you want to follow up on those later on, you can. Okay? Some pictures of some of the different eye gaze devices. Briefly want to talk a little bit about smartphones and access to smartphones from a physical and a cognitive and a visual point of view. You might recognize this as a, if I remove apps or I rearrange the icons, I can often make it a lot easier for somebody to access the device. iOS, interestingly enough, is relatively limited as far as what I'm able to do, because the system kind of locks me out of a lot of things I'd like to be able to do. But sometimes I'll drag unused apps to folders or I'll delete them entirely if my patient's having a hard time with accidental activation of an unwanted app or what have you. Home screens on Android devices actually give me more options because I can take items off the home screen entirely if I don't want them there. I can use one home screen, so if I've got somebody with that bit of a tremor and they tend to wind up swiping their device from left to right, I can get stuff down to one home screen. Using widgets, which are options to make things essentially bigger and present some information, are an option. I can make the icons larger. I can also resize a lot of the things. So just for perspective, this yellow square up here is the size of the standard icon. On Android, I can make bigger ones. I can make a full screen one. This is set to direct dial my wife, so I can hit that relatively large icon to call the people who I'm most commonly calling, rather than trying to get into the contacts. iOS has included very recently a couple of similar options, but at least on that, they're relatively behind what you can do with Android. So Thinking about using a stylus, again, if I'm somebody without that isolated finger control, I can often do things with my stylus that I can't do with an individual finger. I can use a mouse stick. I have a couple of users that are extremely effective using a mouse stick, which is essentially a stylus they hold in their mouth, and they can get around their smartphone a lot faster, almost pretty much as fast as I can do with my fingers. So some people get very, very good with it. But they can also be an option that way. I often talk about it just real briefly if you are using a stylus. If you ever tried to use your smartphone with just regular winter gloves on, you know how it doesn't actually work because it's requiring that conductivity from your finger. So if you are using a stylus, if you have something that you're holding it in or you have a mouse stick with a plastic piece that eliminates the conductivity, it'll work a lot better if you run a wire between your skin and the tip of the stylus. So just, or where you would normally hold the stylus. So just consider those conductivity issues. I'm gonna, somewhat in depth, how am I doing on time? Talk about speech recognition. So probably or possibly a lot of people have heard of Dragon for Windows, Dragon Naturally Speaking, kind of going back a little ways. It's often a little bit oversold in terms of what it's able to do. Speech recognition in general has gotten significantly better over the years. So I will say that if you're someone who used it 15 years ago and said, that doesn't work, it might be worth a revisit. But there are a lot of things that go into speech recognition and using it adequately. So I try to talk a lot about formulating my thoughts. A little outside the context of this group, but I get a lot of students and people will say, oh, they're so verbal, they'll do great with speech recognition. But unless I'm really able to speak out kind of what I want to say in a smooth and relatively measured pace, speech recognition will not work well. If I'm trying to use it on more of a conversational basis, it will generally tend not to work as well. It's gotten a lot better. I mean, I sit here and I look at the transcribe issue that we're using here, and I'm not actually watching, but it's generally probably pretty good, right? But nonetheless, there's a lot that goes into that. If I'm trying to use it for the computer, if I try to say my middle name, let's see how it does. My name is Edward Katie Hitchcock. So as it always does, along with the bullies from the fifth grade playground, it misspelled my middle name as the girl's name, K-A-T-I-E. My middle name is actually C-A-D-Y. So that is one of the things that Dragon will allow me to do to fix, which a standard speech recognition package will not, but I have to know how to do that. So that's one of the things that I kind of talk about when I'm using something like Dragon versus another program. I spent a lot of time talking about dictation strategy. So for the record, I actually use Dragon to do my own clinical documentation pretty routinely. I'm a perfectly decent touch typist, but I prefer to use Dragon at this point in my career. The very first time I tried to use Dragon to write a note, I had been writing notes, and if you asked me to do it with handwriting or type it out, I'd bat out a note in 10 minutes, no problem. I've been doing it for a while at that point in my career. The first time I tried to use Dragon, I said, client. Client utilizing took me a while to get to the point where I could smoothly dictate something like client utilizing Dragon for Windows to accomplish dictation strategy to type an email with moderate verbal cues, period. That sentence that I just spoke took a while for me to develop because the cognitive process of thinking to talk to type is simply distinct from the cognitive process of thinking to type. If you aren't a very good writer to start with, Dragon is not going to help, right? You have to have a fairly decent idea of what it is that you want to say and communicate. And then that will make it a little bit more adequate. There was an interesting study done by the Automobile Association of America, and they did a study on the most distracting things you can do while you're driving. And it was like listening to the radio, listening to an audiobook, placing a phone call by voice, writing an email by voice because you're driving, so they want you to start writing a text message by voice and then writing an email by
All the
voice.
time on the expressway.
That's right, that's what people do. But the idea of the smartphones is that you're not looking at your phone, right? But they did the cognitive distraction interview and they found that writing an email or writing a text by voice is among the most distracting things you can do while you're on the road. You might think you're staring at the road, but you're really not. So it just kind of illustrates my point. There's a lot more cognition that goes into this than one might think. So I always kind of talk about that as a caveat for speech recognition. But that being said, it allows me to do quite a bit with various options. Should have added, I'm sorry, I referenced a trackball a few times earlier. That's an example of a trackball, relatively large ball, which I can use to control my mouse cursor, relatively large buttons that allow me to click. If people want to play with it a little bit later on, it'll be up here. So, speech recognition. I listed out a few different things for what I would call speaker-independent speech recognition. What I mean by that is pretty much anybody in the room can come up and use the products I'm talking about. Pretty much anybody, this is speaker-independent speech recognition. I did not do anything to train this. Pretty much anybody in the room can come up and start talking, and it'll more or less be about as accurate as what you're seeing here as it is with me. Doesn't allow for novel vocabulary. I'm going to guess I can't get this to recognize my middle name. Don't know the background, but hey, it's that. Mostly network dependent, meaning it requires data to work. So again, if you're in one of those more secure environments, I've had patients who couldn't allow the processing of their voice to be sent via the internet to a remote computer for speech recognition. Those are issues that you might be thinking about. I find that they kind of allow for command and control. Voice control on the Mac just got released a couple of weeks ago, and there's quite a bit that you can do with that to control your computer or your iPad or your iPhone. I've still run into a few things I cannot. Thank you. I've still run into a few things I cannot do with my voice on iOS. If anybody wants to tell me how to drag an icon from one screen to another, I'm still looking. My patient wants to be able to do that. And we can't do it with voice control thus far. So the speaker-dependent speech recognition, like Dragon, allows me to use correction strategies, allows me to use that novel vocabulary and stuff like that. Once this is up and running, click minimize. Dragon, where's my glasses? I usually carry about 3 pairs of glasses, one for my ID, one for the top of my head, and one for my nose, and then I usually find them. Click cancel. Click minimize. Press F5. Press F5. Press F5. So I'm going to cheat for a moment. Open Word 2016. Click blank document. Set the font to 28. So I was cheating there because PowerPoint is giving me problems, period. I don't normally give a lecture, or I don't routinely use Dragon with PowerPoint while I'm giving a lecture, period. Delete, I don't normally give a lecture or. Go to end. But this allows me to pretty much do anything I need to do on the computer as well as type using my voice, period. I will say I haven't done a couple of things that I probably should do, like adjusting the sound settings to this environment. I'm using a microphone, which means I'm getting auditory feedback. I'm in a much more echoey room, period. But it's going to make a couple of mistakes in that end, period. Period.
Yeah, we're not seeing any of that.
Feel free to point that out a little more firmly next time. Correct echo we. Correct. Spell that. E-C-H-O-E-Y. Move left 2. Backspace. Choose 1. Go to end. So I just added a novel word to my vocabulary, which does not really exist, but I wanted to use it, period. And that's something I'm able to do with Dragon that I cannot do with those network-dependent, speaker-independent packages, period. Open Google Chrome. Click Maximize. Click Gmail. Press C. Kimberly. Press Enter key. Go to subject. Scratch that. Press Tab key. Hi there. Press Tab key. I don't think Eddie wants to go to soccer, period. I mean tomorrow night, by the way, period. Press Control Enter. Welcome to my sordid domestic life. But I can basically use Dragon to do pretty much anything on the computer that I want to do. And I can use it relatively productively. I was being a little bit more facetious with that email than I might normally be. I would, really sit down there and think about getting Wednesday night into my thing if I wasn't in front of you all and running out of time. But those are options that I might consider using. Very powerful. As I tried to point out, you're not going to do what I was just doing in a few days of training. It takes a while. I've been using speech recognition since I started in the field in '99, and that took some time to develop all of that. But it's an option. All right, let's go back to PowerPoint and have it take over my lecture again. Okay, any quick questions on speech recognition? Okay, cool. Very briefly, we'll talk a little bit about brain control interface. I had the mandate to talk a little bit about emerging, and this is what I would say is emerging technology. I wouldn't say it was something that is going to be helpful for competitive employment, but in my clients with very severe movement disorders, we are trialing some different brain control interfaces that essentially allows a device to read lower level brain waves. It is not like read your mind or read your thought kind of brain control. It allows me to type relatively slowly. Requires relatively good vision. There are some options for auditory feedback. The big issue you'll find is that it's going to be relatively slow compared to almost everything I just talked about. But for those patients or those people who need that for communication, that is pretty important. There was at least one case of a gentleman who developed ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and had a very advanced case that used a model of the P300 BCI that I have upstairs to continue to manage his lab in Pittsburgh. So he was working remotely at that point. Again, I'm sure there was a lot of support, and I will tell you that he was very slow with responding to emails and such. But nonetheless, he had a skill set, and this technology allowed him to continue to participate in his requirements. So hopefully that's coming, but more so. I'm only briefly going to talk about switch access to the computer. Again, if I only am able to move that single switch, head, shoulder, or something like that, more advanced switches or more lighter touch switches, I do have options that allow me to access my entire computer using just that motion. And those are options that we can get into. Uses a process called scanning. Relatively low physical demand, obviously, but a relatively high cognitive demand and also a relatively high time demand. I want to briefly talk about mounting. There are a lot of options. Here's my smartphone. If I'm using a wheelchair and I want to mount to my wheelchair, these are a nice option called modular hose. This one will not work well on that particular armrest, but I had ones that will work a lot better. And that kind of allows me to use an option and then use my speech recognition, for example. Okay, Google. Send a text to my wife, love you very much, period.
Sending your message saying, love you very much.
Okay, welcome to the domestic life. But using that kind of mounting can often make it a lot easier for somebody to do stuff, right? There are tablet mounts that allow me to hold my iPad or my larger Android tablet or my Surface tablet on a wheelchair or wherever else it is that I want. Stuff along those lines. Very briefly, going to talk about low vision and no vision. I try to make a point out for cortical involvement. I think especially in the rehab field, we'll often see issues with vision that are above and beyond the eyeball, but more related to how the brain is processing the vision, called cortical involvement. And again, gets radically overlooked, especially with some of the people with a neurological diagnosis. But assuming there's no cortical involvement, obviously it's relatively easy to get into much more advanced options for magnification. Using a larger monitor can often be an option. Trying to inverse or modify the colors. Again, just use my closed captioning device here, just having it be yellow font on a black background is often a lot easier to see than the blue font on the white background. Apologies, Shirley Ryan, AbilityLab template. Using auditory feedback for reading is often a good option for a lot of people, especially if they do have low vision. Sometimes it's a lot easier to kind of sit back and listen to the computer read something out loud versus trying to use my vision to process it. If I do not have any vision, there are options like JAWS for Windows or a few other options that allow me to navigate completely using the keyboard and the mouse without seeing the monitor. I can use that auditory feedback to tell me what's going on in the computing environment. I could have used that today when you guys couldn't see what I was looking at on my screen. The auditory feedback will tell me, Ed, you gotta minimize your PowerPoint so they can see stuff. Not in so many words, but those options are there. A lot of low vision users will also benefit from that auditory feedback. I know a number of people with low vision that would just prefer to use the stuff that's meant for people who are completely without vision, just because it's easier, especially when you're talking about the computing environment. So those are all options that we can kind of talk about more or demonstrate. I'm wondering if people have questions or things that people would like me to talk about more extensively or see me do a little bit more. Please. I think we're going to bring a microphone around, so are you going to run it?
Yeah.
Great.
Any chance you could redo the keyboards? You could do a sample of using the keyboards again? Do you have a or not?
Using a keyboard?
Using those keyboards that you were showing?
You're talking about with my eyes on the device or a physical one?
The physical one, yes, thank you.
So yeah, the only one I happen to have down here is the Big Keys keyboard. If I plug that in with my USB connection, you ever notice how you never get USB the right way up the first time? It's like statistically impossible, I think. This might take a second. Okay, so yeah, at this point, assuming I'm using it on a table, if this, the best example of this might be somebody with either a visual impairment who is not able to touch type. If I give this to someone who can touch type, they will probably toss it back at me, because if they can touch type on a standard keyboard, that becomes much easier. But if I either have a low vision impairment or a tremor, let's say I'm trying to type the H, I'm not typing anything because the key guard is preventing me right now. I can maybe plant my hand where it belongs and then bring my finger into the H. and I should then be able to type. I have a lot of people who will use that support from the keyguard itself to type that way. Okay. Other questions, comments? Please. I'm sorry, yeah, there's a microphone coming around.
I just wanted to understand where you can purchase a one-handed keyboard.
So I would suggest that you, so right off the top of my head, I would say a tap keyboard, T-A-P, and it's one we have upstairs. I will say that most of the one-handed that's commercially available right now, a BAT keyboard, B-A-T, is also available. They're both what are called BAT. They're both what are called chording keyboards, meaning you type your 5 fingers in a variety of patterns. I don't begin to have them memorized, so I'm not going to get this right. But for example, if I tap, I want to say it's my middle 3 fingers down on the back, I will have produced an H. And E is, I think, my 1 index finger on the back. The tap keyboard is an A, E, I, O, U for my individual fingers, and then an N is these 2 fingers together. A T is these 2 fingers together, and so on. Both of them require some training, obviously. I do want to, I don't sell any products. I do kind of urge that people seek an assistive technology referral. You can actually try them in our department upstairs if you go through the referral process, or you're obviously welcome to identify a referral somewhere else if you so desire. But basically, I would suggest that people kind of do that before you just purchase them online, which is about the only way you can do it. Yes.
What floor are you on?
We are on the 19th floor. Welcome. Other questions, comments? Please, Jessica.
I have a question, is we do have employers in the room, and how does Shirley and Assistive Tech help with like employers in general, how they can help their employees and stuff? Do you have a means of doing that?
So we do, depending on what the funding is, we will go out to an employment place and try to take a look at the environment that's there. More commonly, we'll try to have people come to see us and again, it kind of goes through the process of what I was just talking about. They need to know what the client wants to do for their job. Presumably they have vocational goals. And as I mentioned a few times, that kind of takes us into a higher level of needing to use this stuff to really make it people efficient as possible. But we can have them trial the equipment while they're with us. Do some of the basic training to at least get people to a functionally adequate point of view, if not perfection. And then have them really take it on some work tests as much as possible. So I would really suggest, again, the same thing of just going through the process of getting the referral, which just simply starts with a doctor's order. And then we can kind of hash out having people come in, evaluate what the options might be, and then really have patients, our clients, trial the options in the environment that we're in. Then we go from there. Thank you. Question over there?
With the doctor's order, would you be able to get coverage for a vocational?
So we get coverage, we get coverage from a few different places. We will take health insurance if they will cover it. Some health insurance covers vocational issues, some do not. It puts us under a slightly different restriction in terms of kind of, I hate to say teach to the test, but we have to kind of teach to the point of view of medical necessity versus vocational issues, depending on the insurance. But we do take medical insurance from really most of our clients. But we also will happily talk about setting up private pay arrangements with an employer or what have you. Other questions or comments? But we do favor a team approach at Shirley Ryan, so if there are any compliments and affirmation, I will take those. Complaints should be directed to Deb Crown. And I think at this point I will thank you guys for coming. I think my email's in the PowerPoint, so if anybody does have further follow-up or what have you, please let me know. Thank you.